is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Watelli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. In less than 12 hours, South Koreans will start heading to the polls to choose a new president. Will the election finally draw a line under a dramatic year in politics? Well, North Korea defends its military links with Russia as vital for stability in Europe and Asia. The Foreign Ministry slamming an 11-nation report says that ties with Moscow are the cream of interstate relations. Flash floods destroy homes and roadways in China's Yunnan province. Thousands of residents affected by the deluge over a holiday weekend. And China rejects U.S. claims that it violated their recent tariffs deal, accusing Washington instead of introducing new discriminatory restrictions. The latest quarrel dimming prospects of talks between their leaders. Ahead on East Asia tonight, the global airline industry scales back its profit forecast despite lower oil prices and tariff worries. CNA's Jae-myung finds out why as she speaks with the chief of the International Air Transport Association, Willie Walsh. And the pro wrestling scene in China set to ring the bell for its 10th anniversary. But fears are that the pressures may push it to be counted out. South Koreans are set to head to the polls tomorrow to elect their next president, with the race coming down to two main contenders in a final campaign sprint. A Democratic Party candidate, Jae-myung, leads with nearly 50% support, according to a recent Gallup survey. Now, he toured Greater Seoul, urging voters to change history and defend democracy. His final rally will stream live from Yeouido, the symbolic political hub where lawmakers overturned martial law, triggering former President Yoon Suk-yeol's impeachment. Now, Lee's main rival, Moon-soo of the conservative People Power Party, has closed the gap in recent polls. He visited Jeju to honor April 3rd uprising victims, then toured Busan, Daegu, and Daejeon, ending in Seoul's youth-heavy districts in a bid to win over young voters. Now, regardless of who becomes president, much work lies ahead. The next leader will need to revive a shrinking economy amid wide-ranging U.S. tariffs, re-engage with its key allies after the important meetings were skipped due to political uncertainty, as well as finding ways to mend the political polarization at home. Tensions between South and North Korea could also be a key factor for some voters, especially in the border areas. People living close to the heavily guarded demilitarized zone have backed conservative candidates for decades. Well, CNA's Lim Yun-suk travels to Gangwon province to find out if sentiment is changing.
Restoration efforts are underway to preserve this war-scarred building, which is a must-see attraction for tourists. It was once the Korean Workers' Party headquarters located in North Korea. But when the Korean War ended in 1953, a demilitarized zone was set up. And today, this building stands on the southern side of the peninsula in Cheollong County. Cheollong was once a single region, but it was divided into south and north following the end of the Korean War. It lies within Gangwon province, which is also split between the two Koreas. Residents say tensions with Pyongyang are real and visible here. For instance, North Korea has been broadcasting eerie noises along the border areas, like here in Cheollong, since July last year, aggravating South Koreans.
방송이 계속 들려요. 아주 이상한 소리를 내거든요. 뭐가 찢어지는 소리 같이 막 나고 아주 듣기 싫은 소리. 그런 생각은 다른 데 사람보다는 좀 더 있겠죠. 70년 아니야 100년이 지내서도 눈으로 보이잖아요.
북한에서 삐라를 띄우게 되면은 사격을 하고 또한 비무장지대에서 지뢰 설치해서 폭발물 사고도 나고 또 여러 가지 그런 형태로 이제 북한에서 우리 남한에 대한 그런 상처를 많이 주었어요.
For decades, South Koreans living here voted for conservatives who tend to take a more hardline approach to the north. But Gangwon has seen political shifts in recent years. In the 2012 general election, conservative parties won all 9 seats in the region. But in 2016, the opposition took 1 seat and 2 more 4 years later. However, in last year's general election, the conservative ruling party clinched 6 out of 8 seats in Gangwon, with the opposition even losing 1 seat compared to the 2020 election. The outcome is uncertain this time around too. Some think Moon-soo from the ruling People Power Party might have a chance, as tensions were high when former Liberal President Moon Jae-in was in office.
지금 제 생각은 보수로 좀 갈 것 같아요. 왜냐하면 문재인 대통령 때 금방 통일되는 것 같은 남북 관계가 좋아졌어요. 그런데 나중에는 결과적으로 더 남북 간 해치는 그런 일들이 많이 일어났잖아요. 저 개성공단에 우리 남북 연락사무소 폭파시키고 또한 GP를 폭파시키고 그 윤석열 대통령 때는 그런 관계가 없었어요. 문재인 정부처럼 그런 상황이 일어나서는 안 되겠다라는 생각이.
But then not everyone agrees.
북한이 대한민국하고 그렇게 상대가 된다고 생각지는 않아요. 뭐 군사적으로든 경제적으로든 정치적으로까지. 그렇기 때문에 그렇게 위협을 느끼질 않고 이명박 때도 그랬고 박근혜 때도 그랬고 윤석열 때는 좀 더더욱 심하게 전쟁까지 유발하려고 했던 거고. 근데 그런 거에 대해서도 관심 있는 사람들은 다 알아요. 예전보다는 그러니까 저 진보장 쪽을 더 많이 지지하게 된 것 같아요.
Results will tell when South Koreans go to the polls on June 3rd to elect a new president. Lim Yan-suk, CNA, Cheoran County, Gangwon Province, South Korea.
The South Korea election, meanwhile, has been hit by a wave of misinformation as false claims surge online. Well, then, AFP analysis says many of them focus on foreign interference, tapping into fears of meddling by China, or fabricating support from the United States for South Korea's conservative camp. Now, one falsehood circulating online suggests weaknesses in the overseas voter registration system and that Chinese nationals are exploiting the system to cast fraudulent ballots. Opposition leader and election frontrunner Jae-myung is a popular target for disinformation. Many claims touch on his alleged allegiance to Beijing, feeding into a narrative that casts progressive candidates as being sympathetic to or even controlled by China. For conservatives, the misinformation tends to be related to their ties to the United States. Some ethnic Chinese are also feeling the pressure from mounting anti-Beijing sentiment ahead of South Korea's election. Well, that's as China appears to displace longtime rival Japan in many South Koreans' minds as Seoul's most distrusted neighbor in recent years. A former leader, Yoon Suk-yeol, had referred to vague allegations of Chinese spying when he tried to justify his martial law declaration, which led to his ousting. Conspiracy theories have since grown among the South Korea right, fueling the distrust. And we will have more coverage later on South Korean politics, including a look at the legal woes that have plagued so many presidencies in Seoul. On that note, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, steelmakers in South Korea under pressure after Donald Trump said he will double U.S. tariffs on imports to 50%.
Nobody is going to benefit from tariffs on aviation. And I think when you stand back and look at the facts and the figures, it would support continuing a regime where tariffs don't impact on the delivery of new aircraft or engines.
Now, the head of the International Air Transport Association hits out at tariffs in an interview with CNA's Jae-myung. Hello again. Time now for business news with Roland Lim. So, Roland, it seems like more trouble brewing between the world's top 2 economies.
You heard right. Hopes are dimming of a phone call this week between the leaders of the US and China after Beijing accused Washington of violating their recent trade deal. China says the US unilaterally introduced new discriminatory restrictions, including new guidelines on AI chip export controls, curbs on chip design software sales to China, and revoking Chinese student visas. China's Commerce Ministry also pushed back against Donald Trump's claims that Beijing had breached the agreement. White House officials accusing China of, quote, slow rolling their compliance and not speeding up exports of critical minerals needed for cutting-edge electronics. China says that these claims are bogus and has vowed to take measures to defend its interests. Earlier, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent spoke to CBS's Face the Nation, saying that he's confident that the trade dispute will be ironed out when Mr. Trump talks to the Chinese president. Ira Spitzer explains what the two leaders might hope to achieve, especially as tariffs hang in legal limbo and as tensions over Taiwan soar.
Well, several of President Trump's top officials, top economic advisors have been out there presenting a united front on the president's tariff regime. Now, there is some legal limbo with the tariffs. There was a U.S. court decision last week which paused those tariffs, although then on appeal, those tariffs were declared legal, at least until some of these details are worked out. So not actually declared legal, but simply the court is going to assess that at a later date. But these economic advisors out there really trying to show that the tariffs are going to be the way forward for President Trump, at least as things stand now. And there is this 90-day pause on tariffs. But if that 90-day pause expires later this summer, then we would, of course, see a resumption of those tariffs, which had a very significant negative impact on global markets, and specifically the reciprocal tariffs between the U.S. and China, both of which are over 100%. So that is the context in which we have President Trump's advisors saying that there's a potential call in the works here between President Trump and Chinese leader Xi. Now, there's been no confirmation of that possible call from the Chinese side, but that is at least what the American side is saying. And this all comes in a period of an escalation of at least some rhetoric, some negative rhetoric between the two sides. We saw at the Shangri-La dialogue there in Singapore with U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth calling China an imminent threat towards Taiwan and urging Asian countries to ramp up defense spending as a result. That statement angered China. We've also seen the proposed cancellation of Chinese student visas here in the U.S. And we saw President Trump himself on Friday saying that China had not lived up to the agreement in Geneva that the two countries made last month, which led to that pause in the tariffs. So there's been certainly some rhetoric here, but all of this, of course, could be the prelude to more talks between these two countries. And at least if you believe what President Trump's advisors are saying, those talks could come as soon as this week. And while things do appear to be on somewhat of a downward trajectory now, of course, the hope among many is that if these two sides can actually talk, that there could be a longer-term deal in place which could forestall those possible tariffs.
South Korean steelmakers reeling after fresh tariff threats from Washington. Shares of POSCO and Hyundai Steel more than 3% in the Redwall Sayar Steel plunge by nearly 9%. This comes after U.S. President Trump announced that he will double tariffs on imported steel and aluminium to 50% starting Wednesday. South Korea was the fourth biggest steel exporter to the U.S. last year. Its steel shipments to America rose 12% in April from a year earlier, despite existing tariffs. But industry experts say that the new 50% rate could squeeze Korean exporters further, especially those that held back from U.S. expansion to avoid scrutiny, despite surging American steel prices. Now, South Korean Industry Ministry says that it will be stepping in. Officials are preparing to respond to the looming 50% tariff in trade talks with Washington. They've also held an emergency meeting with top steel firms like POSCO and Hyundai Steel. Steel tariffs were one of Mr. Trump's first moves when he returned to office. 25% duties took effect from 12th of March, and now the stakes are rising. Markets across the Asia-Pacific bracing for fresh data that could reveal how deep the trade war's impact really is. Starting in Seoul, the Kospi ending the day flat on the eve of snap presidential elections. The Korean won is edging stronger against the greenback by 0.5% as factory activity showed signs of no relief. In data out earlier, South Korea's factory floor remained in contraction territory for the fourth straight month in May. Frail domestic demand and the impact of U.S. tariffs weighed on factory output. Now, May's Purchasing Managers Index slipped to 47.7, marking the fourth straight month of contraction. Analysts point to frail domestic demand and the drag from U.S. steel tariffs as key headwinds. Over in Tokyo, the Nikkei 225 under pressure today after Nippon Steel reopened trading post the Trump tariff announcement on Friday. Japanese traders were digesting President Trump's pledge to double U.S. tariffs to 50%, even as he touted a new steel partnership between Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel. Mainland Chinese markets closed for a holiday, but Hong Kong was open. It closed the day 0.6% lower, although it did plummet 2.7% earlier on that China-U.S. trade tensions. Offshore yuan unchanged, 7.207, changing hands with $1 US. Now, every year, the International Air Transport Association, or IATA, releases a report which gives a snapshot of the health of the aviation industry. Now, this year's version looks into the challenges around travel in an era of uncertainties. Let's get some insight from Yasmin Yonkers, who's in New Delhi at the IATA Annual General Meeting.
The latest IATA annual report just out today showed strong profitability for airlines this year, beating last year's numbers but falling short of projections. So aviation is still an optimistic space despite uncertainties to global markets in the first half of this year. Asia-Pacific travel is strong, with China accounting for more than 40% of the region's traffic. I spoke with the IATA Director General Willie Walsh here in New Delhi, and he explained the very heart of this resilience.
People love traveling. People, need to travel. People want to travel. And, where we've seen the demand being impacted is where actually, it's outside of the control of the industry. It's often, we can't provide the supply or there are restrictions in how we operate. And when these restrictions are removed, as was evident during the COVID recovery period, the demand for aviation took off again. So I think for us, it's very encouraging that demand remains strong, even in an environment where the general macroeconomic situation has changed. It's certainly softer than most people would have expected. But we expect GDP growth at a global level to be about 2.5%. And quite honestly, that's not a bad figure. And certainly for the airline industry, it will translate into growth in passenger demand of around 5.8%. So I think this year remains positive. It's not as strong as we had expected when we looked at the forecast, at the beginning of this year. But I think it's still a reasonably good position for the industry.
Mr. Walsh, you've been in this industry a long time, having played so many different roles. If President Trump had your year, what would you advise him on account of tariffs and aviation growth?
Well, I don't think he would need my advice to understand that aircraft manufacturing, engine manufacturing has been a huge positive for the U.S. economy. Very strong exports, Boeing, the GE engines, Pratt & Whitney, all of these are very important products on a global scale, and the US has definitely benefited from that. Typically, aircraft engines and parts for aircraft and engines are excluded from the tariff regime, and quite honestly, we would believe that that's the most appropriate way to deal with this going forward. Nobody is going to benefit from tariffs on aviation. And I think when you stand back and look at the facts and the figures, it would support continuing a regime where tariffs don't impact on the delivery of new aircraft or engines.
Mr. Walsh, you've always been bullish on China, but here we are in India, another huge driver of aviation growth. Now, the two don't always see eye to eye. It doesn't matter, does it?
No, it doesn't. But I think it's a fascinating example of where you've got two fantastic economies to population bases very similar, 1.45 billion people here in India, and where aviation has made such a positive impact on socio-economic issues in both countries. And I've always pointed to China and indeed to India as an example of where aviation does make such a difference. And, when you look at India, they haven't seen the same investment in high-speed rail that China has seen. So they're going to be even more dependent on air connectivity to enable them to take advantage of the, fantastic opportunity that exists here. So I think for economic purposes, India is going to benefit significantly from the growth in aviation that we have been seeing and that we're likely to see in the future. It's going to be a fascinating country to watch.
With jet fuel prices now at a point where they're actually benefiting airlines, do you expect sustainability to still take a very, very strong theme when it comes to airplane makers and what airlines want?
Yeah, because environmental sustainability is a long-term issue. We have a goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050, still 25 years away. We won't stop there. We've got to move beyond our dependence on sustainable aviation fuels and other methods that will help us to get to our net zero position. So I think most airline CEOs take a long-term view on this. We understand that as an industry, we've got to play our part. Every industry is looking to see what it can do to be more efficient. For the airline industry, actually, there's always been an incentive for us to be as efficient as we possibly can. So I would expect that to continue, even though the current price of oil is lower than maybe people had expected.
And in your report, you have some strong words for SAF producers.
Yeah, very, very disappointing. We have so many people who are committed to net zero, who are prepared to stand up and say, we're fully behind this. Those words aren't being translated into actions. And, we've had enough nice words. We now need action. And we're not where we need to be in terms of the production of sustainable fuels for aviation. We're disappointed that a number of the major fuel suppliers have pulled back on commitments that they had made. And we think it's time for them to stand up and play their part. Because we've always said, the airline industry can't do this alone. We will require the support and action on the part of everybody in the wider value chain. And that's true for aircraft manufacturers, engine manufacturers, but it's particularly true for fuel producers as well.
So for context, IATA's report estimates that the average cost of SAF in 2024 was 3.1 times that of jet fuel. And this year, that's expected to jump to 4.2 times. Hence the disappointment of Willie Walsh, the Director General of IATA. Much more to come here from New Delhi. You can catch my conversation tomorrow with the CEO of Indigo, who has grand ambitions to push the airline global after 18 years of domestic growth. Plus, Prime Minister Narendra Modi will also be here later for a keynote speech. I'll bring you the highlights here on CNA. I'm Yasmin Yonkers.
And it's also a wrap for me for Business News. Natalie.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, coming up next on East Asia tonight, South Korea will have a new president soon, looking to put the political drama behind. But legal woes seem to be a recurring theme plaguing the highest office. We spoke to experts on how to break the cycle. You're watching East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. China rejects U.S. claims that it violated their recent tariffs deal, accusing Washington instead of introducing new discriminatory restrictions. North Korea has defended its military cooperation with Russia, stressing that their close ties are aimed at ensuring peace and stability, both in Europe and Asia. And South Korea is set to head to the polls tomorrow to pick a new president, as contenders make their case to voters in a final campaign sprint. Well, among South Koreans voting tomorrow is a significant group of first-timers. Now, this youth is not just concerned about the slowing economy, but also a growing gender divide. A Gallup poll last month showed more than half of young male voters likely to support right-wing policies, while nearly half of young female voters lean to the left of the political spectrum. South Korea's young women could prove to be resistance to the nation's conservative candidates. A Reuters report says this segment of voters feel ostracized by the policies of conservative parties. A conservative candidate Lee Jun-suk of the New Reform Party, for example, promised to abolish the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family.
제일 이제 피부로 느끼는 게 여성, 소수자, 장애인, 노동 이런 정책이잖아요. 그렇다 보니까 뭐 북한 관련해서는 좀 상대적으로 관심이 덜하고 말하신 대로 사회적 이슈 관련해서 진보와 보수를 나뉘게 되는 것 같아요.
According to Reuters, South Korea's young male voters have swung towards conservative policies. According to the report, some male voters feel their female counterparts have it easier in society.
사회에 화가 나는 건 아무래도 남성만 군 복무를 해야 되는 거. 그게 가장 지금까지 제가 느끼는 대한민국에서 젊은 남자로 사면서 아무래도 가장 불합리한 일이라고 생각이 듭니다. 가장 청춘일 시기인 21살, 22살 그때를 다른 여성들과는 달리 사회에서 활동을 잘 하지 사회에서 이제 다양한 활동을 누릴 수 있는 시기임에도 불구하고 군대에서 이제 1년 6개월을 복무를 하면서
The South Korean voters are hoping that the political drama of the past half a year can be put behind them. But if history is any indication, it's that politics is a dangerous game in Seoul. CNA's Grace Shin has more.
In South Korea, winning the presidency is a major victory. But finishing the job with your reputation intact? History suggests that's a challenge. Time and again, presidents have entered office with power and promise, only to leave in disgrace. The latest, President Yoon Suk-yeol, the third leader to be impeached. After a failed attempt to impose martial law in December, he now faces criminal charges for insurrection. And he's far from alone. Park Geun-hye was impeached in 2017, later jailed for corruption. Lee Myung-bak got 17 years for embezzlement and bribery. Roh Moo-hyun, under investigation, took his own life in 2009. Chun Doo-hwan, who seized power in a coup, was convicted of treason. Park Chung-hee ruled nearly 2 decades until he was assassinated, and Lee Seung-man, the founding president, fled into exile after election fraud was exposed. 6 decades, 6 dishonorable exits, and counting. Why do so many South Korean presidencies end in tragedy, not triumph? Evans Revere, a U.S. diplomat and Korea expert, says it comes down to deep political polarization and a culture of revenge.
The polarization and the extremism and the all or nothing atmosphere of elections brings into power every few years a new party, usually. And there is this sense that it's time for payback. It's time for retribution.
South Korean presidents serve a single 5-year term, no re-election. 1 year lost to transition, another to handing over. That leaves just 3 years to make a mark and immense pressure to deliver fast. Professor Shin Yu from Myeongji University calls this an imperial presidency.
미국도 제왕적인데 우리나라는 더 제왕적이거든요. 왜 그러냐 하면 우리나라 같은 경우에는 연방제 하에서 대통령제를 실시하는 국가가 아니라 이건 그러니까 대통령한테 모든 권한이 집중이 돼 있는데 사실은 그 권한이 집중돼 있다라는 거는 책임을 물을 소재도 단순하게 된다라는 걸 의미하거든요. 자기가 특정 정치인 좋아할 때는 거의 이거는 트러스트가 아니라 빌리프의 수준이에요. 예? 종교적 신앙심과 같은 수준으로 특정 정치인을 좋아한다라는 얘기예요. 예? 그러니까 그 모든 정치인한테 해당되는 건 아니에요. 그러면 다른 정치인 바라볼 때에는 또 그렇게 생각하지 않아요. 이중적 잣대라는 거죠.
Beyond the social media-induced feeling of savior versus the enemy, Revere warns that democratic institutions are being weaponized.
The prosecutorial system, the use of the National Assembly, I think in particular, the weaponization of the National Assembly, I think that has been a particular phenomenon over the last 2 or 3 years, where you have an incumbent government of one party, and then you have the opposition in control of the National Assembly. And because of all the factors that you and I have been discussing, You have this extreme polarization, and you have had a system in which the opposition has used its domination of the National Assembly to prevent the business of government from going on in a normal fashion. A president, an acting president, and acting president have either been impeached or threatened with impeachment. That's incredible to think about.
In order to break that cycle, according to Revere, Seoul needs to invest in a bipartisan national commission.
Give them a 6-month or a 1-year mandate to look at Korean politics, to look at the denouement of these political campaigns, to reflect, as I've suggested earlier, on what has transpired, why it happened, why a certain faction, if you will, of the previous government felt that it had no choice. I was deeply impressed by how inspired, I think, by how quickly Koreans, members of the cabinet, members of the elites, even members of the military and security services, etc., how quickly Koreans rallied against the declaration of martial law, and how quickly that attempted imposition of military rule in Korea fell apart.
According to Professor Shin, there needs to be constitutional reform.
내각제로 개헌을 하는 것이 유일한 방법입니다. 지금 뭐 4년 주임제, 4년 연임제, 이거는 제가 항상 얘기하는 게 8년짜리 제왕을 뽑는 거나 마찬가지라고 얘기를 합니다.
South Korea has experienced rapid economic rise, but the presidential terms left unfinished. And December's failed martial law risk hanging over the electorate as they once again head to the polls. Grace Shin, CNA.
Well, for more on the presidential election in South Korea, do head to our website, cna.asia. Meantime, North Korea has defended its military cooperation with Russia, stressing that their close ties are aimed at ensuring peace and stability, both in Europe and Asia. Pyongyang was responding to a recent report by the Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team, also known as MSMT, which said that North Korea had enabled Russia's increased attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. North Korea's foreign ministry called the MSMT a bogus group which has no legality, adding that it encroached upon North Korea's sovereign rights and is a violation of international legal principles. MSMT is an initiative formed by 11 countries last year, following Russia's veto not to renew the UN panel of experts on North Korea. Well, its report stated that North Korea has transferred to Russia at least 100 ballistic missiles, which were subsequently launched into Ukraine. It added that Pyongyang had deployed over 11,000 troops into eastern Russia in late 2024. Now, ties between North Korea and Russia have strengthened in recent years. Last year, Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un signed an agreement pledging mutual aid if either country faces aggression. Their military cooperation has sparked concerns from other countries. At the annual Shangri-La Defense Summit in Singapore last week, French President Emmanuel Macron urged China to prevent its ally North Korea from joining Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Now, turning our attention to other news now. Intense rainfall in China's southwest Yunnan province has triggered flash floods, damaging dozens of homes and destroying buildings, where nearly 5,000 people are affected by the extreme weather. Footage released by state media shows residents being rescued by boats in flooded areas. There are also reports of landslides. According to local media, several hundred people have been evacuated. The torrential rain are also causing rivers to overflow, flooding nearby homes and crops. Repair work on damaged roads and power lines are ongoing, but more rain is forecast in the coming days. Coming up next on East Asia Tonight, regional tensions and the U.S.-China rivalry takes center stage at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Details in just a moment. And the pro wrestling scene in China struggles to kick out against pinning pressures. Find out why next. China has hit back at comments by the Philippine Defense Secretary, stressing that Beijing has a full historical and legal basis to uphold territorial sovereignty in the South China Sea. It has also reiterated that Beijing has been exercising a high degree of restraint in a disputed waterway. The reaction came as tensions played out at the Shangri-La dialogue over the weekend, and CNA's Olivia Seong was there.
The rivalry between China and the U.S. has been in key focus at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. But speaking at a plenary session on the third and final day of the Security Summit, Philippines Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro said while the China-U.S. strategic competition increasingly defines the regional and global security environment, it should not be overemphasized.
The Philippine position on the West Philippine Sea is not a function of Sino-American strategic rivalry. Instead, it is caused, no doubt, by the overreach of the Chinese Communist Party, of which the most glaring evidence is the 9, 10, or 11 dash line that has absolutely no basis in international law.
Manila has accused Beijing of aggressive behavior in the disputed South China Sea and building artificial islands in the disputed waters. China, on the other hand, has been angered by joint military drills between the U.S. and the Philippines, as well as the deployment of American military systems in the country. Secretary Teodoro's comments drawing a response from Chinese delegates in the room.
Recently, the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that the Russian-Ukraine war is a proxy war between nuclear powers and needs to be ended. And meanwhile, the United States is selling more arms to this region and setting up more military bases in the Philippines. So, if the proxy war in Europe needs to be ended, are you concerned that a proxy war in Asia might be launched?
Both Vietnam and Malaysia have differences with China in South China Sea. Yet, both countries have effectively managed these differences with China. So my question is, why can't the Philippines do the same?
The comparison between the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Let us not forget that while we are members of ASEAN, we are sovereign countries, each with its own territorial integrity and sovereignty. And I am sure that if what China is doing to the Philippines is done to Malaysia or to any ASEAN country, you would see a different reaction. I hope I have answered the propaganda to the satisfaction of everyone in this room.
The Chinese delegation later told CNA that it was unsatisfied with the defense secretary's reply.
首先，他实际上没有认真回答这个问题，他说我是敷衍的，他说我们是宣传口号，难道说那个马来西亚的总理安瓦尔，人家给他提的问题是敷衍的吗？人家是一种宣传吗？人家是要求他去跟中国要去对话，是吧？
The heated exchange comes as China's Defense Minister Dong Jun was absent from this year's Security Summit. The lower-level delegation from the military's National Defense University instead led by its Vice President, Rear Admiral Hu Gangfeng.
Unlike previous years, there was no plenary session helmed by the Chinese defense minister this time round. These sessions typically reserved for those at the minister level and above. Instead, this time, the head of the Chinese delegation spoke at a smaller session on maritime security. What was also different was the lack of press briefings by the Chinese delegation compared to last year. Those in the past had been called by the Chinese to rebut criticism of it and to lay out the Chinese position on security issues.
The Chinese delegation has said that this was a normal working arrangement, which will not affect it from expressing its views on security issues. Speaking at another session, Singapore's Defence Minister Chan Chun Sing said that it was incumbent on other countries to reach out to China to build bridges to avoid misinterpreting each other's position. Olivia Xiong, CNA, Singapore.
Well, under pressure but undeterred in a frontier even light struggles to reach, countries are grappling with a quiet and potentially deadly new threat to their undersea cabling networks. Well, this was also a topic of keen interest among defense ministers attending the Shangri-La dialogue.
Undersea cables form the backbone of global communications, making them a shared strategic vulnerability.
That concern widely shared among defense ministers gathering in Singapore amid an exponential growth in the use of submarine cables. The IISS Asia Pacific Regional Assessment 2025 describes the subsea domain as an increasingly critical arena, which may even be a decisive one in any major conflict in the Western Pacific. At the heart of it, an extensive network of undersea cables spanning more than 1 million kilometers, transcending international and continental boundaries, and carrying the vast majority of the world's internet traffic. This subsea information superhighway transmits everything from streaming videos to financial transactions to diplomatic communications and essential intelligence. Most cable damage is unintentional, from human error or natural disaster. But it's the intentional damage that's raising the alarm, either through sabotage or espionage. Since 2023, there have been at least 11 cases of undersea cable damage around Taiwan and at least 11 such incidents in the Baltic Sea. Severing communications incognito is grey zone warfare, commonly under a cloak of deniability, which makes it hard to build a case.
With damaging of power cables, we would have blackouts in some parts of the country. With damaging of telecommunication cables, we would have lack of communication between the states, between Sweden and Poland, for example. So the consequences could be very, very serious.
Europe has a war on its doorstep, one in which malign actors have readily used undersea sabotage to gain advantage. NATO alliance countries are building defense capabilities in response.
We need to make sure that we have the maritime capabilities to respond. What we often see is when Russian ships are close to us and we show with our maritime capabilities that we are seeing them and that we are detecting them, they often go away. So deterrence is working.
Finland's model of comprehensive security has been a good basis for preparing to the hybrid influencing. Undersea dimension faces unique and complex challenges due to the difficult operating environment.
Even as nations work towards boosting their own capabilities and defense against any threats, officials emphasize the importance of working with allies.
Reactions of the NATO has been also very straightforward, actually. So we are helping each other, and we are in Estonia ready to defend our critical infrastructure on the Finnish Gulf, Baltic Sea as well. But once again, together with our allies.
シャングリラ会合の3カ国が今こそオーシャンの下で各国が手を携えて対話を重ね、ルールに基づく国際秩序の溶解ではなく回復をなし。
What we can do is we can do our very best to make it people's worthwhile for actors, state actors and others to obey the rules of the road.
But unlike the rules of the road, the rules of the sea are frequently in dispute, and pinning blame for subsea sabotage is fraught. With thousands more kilometers of cabling planned for the Earth's seabed, undersea security has become a paramount concern for many nations.
Finally, consumer confidence in China remains fragile. Many sectors are finding it hard to dodge the economic blows, and that includes its young pro wrestling scene, which is fighting to stay on its feet as consumers tighten their purse strings. CNA's Lauren Ong with this report.
Body slams and battle cries. It may look like WWE, but this isn't America. It's Middle Kingdom Wrestling, one of China's few homegrown wrestling promotions, infused with a distinct local twist. It's celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year.
the Chinese wrestling industry is still quite niche. And what the main thing is that we need to cultivate an environment where it's going to allow a Chinese wrestler to break out. That is what's going to build up the scene.
But the journey hasn't been easy. NKW once rode a wave of pre-pandemic momentum, selling out shows and profiting from merchandise. But as China's economic slowdown bites, the bi-monthly affair is now a biannual one.
We kind of slow down a bit and try to find opportunities. What we have found is that as the economy continues to be sluggish for a lot of industries, that people are still, as long as it's marketed right, as long as the angle is there, the right angle is there, I think people are willing to watch something like pro wrestling.
As part of efforts to spur consumption, in January, authorities relaxed rules for staging large-scale commercial performances. Still, pro wrestling is struggling to carve out its audience as debate persists over whether it's a violent sport or stage spectacle. Whatever you call it, it's specialized and can be costly. A ticket at the front row will set you back about $70, while the cheapest cost about $26. Its live stream, which is free, typically attracts several thousands of views.
The drama, the excitement, tension, this is what makes pro wrestling. Here at this venue, close to 400 seats are filled, but the ambition goes beyond these four walls.
现场摔跤的气氛跟直播那没法比啊！现场摔跤那什么气氛？那能站起来喊啊！那是。
其实并不是很贵，因为我在这里可以看到现场的氛围，还有我们的一些这个头部的 UP 主，还有一些这个我们头部顶级的中摔选手，我觉得非常的值。
There was no event in Shanghai this year, so I had to go see this 10-year anniversary.
MKW says the next step is to expand beyond fan hubs like Guangdong and Shanghai into new markets like Beijing. For now, pro wrestling in China remains a niche pursuit powered by passion, not profit.
我有一段时间是职业打摔跤的，但是只是一段时间，大多数人都要去外面工作啊，赚其他钱，摔跤只能作为一个副业，但是有人是主业，但是很少。
And in an economy looking for new ways to get people spending, the industry's toughest match might not be in the ring, but in consumers' wallets. Lauren Ong, CNA, Beijing.
I hope you've enjoyed Monday's edition of East Asia tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia, and you can also find us on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching.